Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special conversation brought to you from and by the George Washington University with some of the top experts in a very relevant discussion and field as we look at election 2020 and specifically what happens next. It's a question everybody's been asking since it started happening, and the very first returns started coming in yesterday. Where do we stand right now? We know that we have a razor-thin election. We are awaiting additional early and mail-in ballots counted up in key battleground states to determine who will be the next president of the United States. Today, a very important conversation at a critical moment in our history with George Washington University academics and experts who really are at the front of their fields. What we want to do today is to take you deeper than any conversation you'll get anywhere else and take a look at both what is next and what is at stake and where this is likely to go over the next several hours and several days, perhaps even several weeks. I'm thrilled to welcome this panel that you see, and I'd like to start by introducing them to you. Paul Schiff Berman is the Walter S. Cox Professor of Law at the George Washington University School of Law. Hello, Paul. You're muted, Paul, and all of you, so you may unmute yourself so that we can hear you. Paul is an expert on issues related to the Supreme Court and constitutional law, and certainly the Supreme Court may be involved in all of this. You may have seen or read him in national media as he discusses issues related to various Supreme Court issues and decisions. Let's try that again. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Frank. Thanks for having me.
Laura Brown is the Associate Professor and Director of the Graduate School of Political Management, a great colleague and friend. She is an expert in so many of these areas. Hi, Laura.
Hello, Frank. It's wonderful.
A couple books I need to shout out because they're right exactly in the right spot, and we'll give people an idea of just exactly where you have focused and studied. Amateur Hour, Presidential Character and the Question of Leadership is your latest book, and you also wrote a book called Jockeying for the American Presidency, the Political Opportunism of Aspirants. So that might have something to do with the conversation we're having here. Spencer Overton, Professor of Law at GW Law. Welcome to you as well.
Frank, thanks so much for having me.
Well, you bring unbelievable credentials to this conversation. You served as Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General in President Obama's Department of Justice in the Office of Legal Policy, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And you served in his campaign transition, looking at special interests, enhancing transparency when you were working in a variety of places. I think a couple things worth shouting out for everybody, Spencer, because of this conversation we're having here. You chaired the Election Assistance Commission Agency Review Team, and you served as a member of the Federal Election Commission Agency Review Team as well. So these are very relevant places where you've been looking specifically at how people vote, counting of ballots, absentee voting, and that kind of thing.
Correct.
Lena Wen, welcome to you.
Hi, nice to talk to you and to everybody else.
Lena Wen is a visiting professor of health policy and management at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. She happens to be an emergency room physician, served as health commissioner for the city of Baltimore, and is an expert on governmental response to public health crises. And given that this election took place in the middle of a public health crisis, it can't be more relevant. For those of you who don't know me, I am Frank Sesno, and I am with the School of Media and Public Affairs. Before joining GW, I was with CNN for many years as Washington bureau chief in the bureau and White House correspondent, among other things, and covered many elections. I won't say like this because there were none quite like this. Laura Brown, let's start with you for the snapshot of where we are as we speak at 4:06, the day after Election Day. Razor thin, not determined. Key battleground states are counting. What's out there? What are you expecting?
Well, so let me just say, because I think it's important to be said, that at this point in time, we have over 130 million ballots that have already been counted. We are less than 24 hours from a poll closing. And I think really what that is a sign of is actually how functioning our democracy is. I do think that too often, both the media and pundits spend time focused on the problems and not necessarily the things that are really achievements. We had very few incidents across the country yesterday, and we had tens of millions of people cast early ballots. So I do think it's important to just start with that. What we do know, though, is that right now, former President Joe Biden is leading in the Electoral College over current President Donald Trump. There are a handful of states that are yet to be called or determined. The most recent one that was sort of assigned as an apparent winner for the former vice president is Wisconsin. That's an important state because that's a pickup from 2016. We've also got, obviously, Arizona that appears to be trending toward Biden, Nevada that appears to be trending toward Biden, Michigan as well in that column. And then, of course, there's Pennsylvania that has the most sort of left to be counted in terms of absentee ballots, still trending toward Biden. Also, interestingly enough, the Georgia election, because of where the votes are coming from, appears to be the true toss-up in this race. North Carolina appears to be trending a little bit toward the president.
Spencer Overton, since you have been so focused and you're such an expert in absentee ballots and this whole process, I think it's very safe to say, and it's important to say, that election day continues. Election day was yesterday. People who were voting in real time, they got their votes counted then, but the vote counting continues. This is not like something has stopped and started.
Right, that's right. And Frank, just to build on Laura's piece, Americans should have faith in the voting process. This is all natural. This is all typical in terms of how things are done. We've got to count every vote, including those votes that came in through mail and through absentee. Right now, I don't know that it's clear that this election is within the margin of, they say, the margin of litigation, right? I don't know that the litigation is going to determine. If we just look at the map right now and, building on what you said and Laura said, assuming Michigan and Pennsylvania are open, and let's just say we said Wisconsin, Arizona, and Nevada, and Maine to Biden, and North Carolina and Georgia to Trump, then Pennsylvania and Michigan seem to be real keys. Biden needs just one of them if he can pick up that extra electoral vote in Maine, but Trump needs both of those. And so from my standpoint, a lot of it seems to come down to Pennsylvania and these absentees in Pennsylvania. Typically across the country, only about a quarter, about 24% of ballots are cast by vote by mail or by absentee. Right. That was 2016. It's over twice as much of that this year. And so part of the issue, Frank, with absentees and vote by mail is this notion that many of them are rejected here because they lack a signature or there's not a signature match. So what I'm honed in on right now is what challenges are being made in Pennsylvania with regard to that. There's also a concept called the ballot curing process, where can people who are voting absentee come in and confirm their signature if they're rejected or something like that. So to me, a lot of this count of the absentees, particularly in Pennsylvania, that seems to be where there could be a lot of discussion over the course of the next day or so.
I want to come back in another minute, Spencer, and talk about the vote curing process and the challenge and where those are going to happen. But Paul, before I do that, the President of the United States has already said Supreme Court. You don't go straight to the Supreme Court, do you, without going to a lot of other places first? What do we make of that? What do you make of that? Yeah, you're muted, Paul. Sorry.
I think it's demagoguery. It's destructive of the democracy to make statements like that, or frankly, to claim that the election's over and that I won when the vote is still being counted. The way the election would, the way a court challenge would go forward in most cases, would be a challenge, if we're talking about what Spencer was talking about, to particular kinds of ballots or particular votes, and how they should count. Those are usually determined by the state based on state law, either state constitutional law or state statutory law, what counts as a ballot. And so that would be determined within the state system. And in theory, there's no particular reason for the US Supreme Court to get involved at all in a question of state law, unless there is a claim that what the state courts are doing is somehow contrary to federal statutory law or federal constitutional law. And a lot of these things might not be. The big question in Pennsylvania that's going to go to the Supreme Court immediately is the decision of the state Supreme Court to allow ballots that were postmarked by Election Day, but not received until afterwards. And the courts, the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania said that that is okay. Under the Pennsylvania Constitution, they were interpreting the Pennsylvania Constitution. The Republicans are challenging that by saying that that is in violation of the elections clause of the Constitution. And so that's how they're going to the Supreme Court, at least to challenge that tranche of votes.
And so what would
in general, you don't just go straight to the Supreme Court.
What would the Supreme Court be deciding in that case? And what would be the implications of that?
Well, in theory, the Supreme Court could decide that indeed the state Supreme Court didn't have the power to extend the deadline for the receipt of the ballots because it violates the elections clause, which supposedly gives that power to the legislature, not to the state Supreme Court. Now, the problem is that part of the Constitution was written at a time before judicial review was sort of a normal thing within the American polity. So when they said legislature, at least in past cases, the US Supreme Court has interpreted that to mean the state government generally. But the Republicans are taking sort of a literal reading and saying that if it's not the state legislature, the state Supreme Court has no power whatsoever to extend those deadlines. And in theory, if the US Supreme Court agreed with that, it would invalidate the counting only of the late arriving ballots. It wouldn't do anything about what's being counted right now. And it may be that Biden wins in Pennsylvania without those late arriving ballots. So it may be moot, but that's what it would invalidate.
Let me follow on with this, Spencer, back to you for a moment. Take the case that surfaced for a moment or two in Harris County, Texas. The whole question of drive-through drop-off balloting, voting.
Right.
That could have put into question 120,000 or so people who had voted up to that point, and ultimately it did after those who would have done afterwards because they were told not to do that. Are there cases like that in other states where votes already cast could be called into question? What are the most serious cases out there that you're aware of?
Well, I think that getting into Paul's piece here, the question is to what extent are we going to defer to the state legislature in terms of in terms of the state Supreme Court? The case that you brought up before, on one hand, they said that we can't do any more drive-throughs here, but the courts also said that they're not going to throw out those 120,000 votes.
Okay.
So the notion of completely rejecting those votes that are collected in terms of the 3 days, I don't know that there is a case that I have seen that is right on point. There may be one, but I haven't seen a case that's right on point in terms of that. Paul, do you know of one?
No, I mean, and it's ironic because historically, when the federal courts have gotten involved in voting cases, it has been specifically because the states are blocking people from voting. And we need the courts to step in to secure voting rights. What's happening right now is that the Trump campaign and the Republican Party is using litigation to try to take away people's votes or the ability of those votes to be counted. And that's really unprecedented from anything I know.
Laura, how are you watching this? Because I know you're watching this quite closely.
Yeah, I mean, I just think what is so important is that there is a kind of bigger political takeaway from all of this, is that currently the Trump campaign appears to believe that their only way forward is through the courts, which suggests that they know that they are in trouble in the states themselves. And I do think that this is where it's really important just to be patient. These votes are going to get counted. The Biden campaign is sort of very bullish on where we are with the votes that are outstanding. And I do think that when you just look at the way that both campaigns are responding, what you see is that the president's campaign is making contradictory arguments in Arizona and Nevada from those that they are making in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. That will not, I imagine, sort of hold up in any sort of sustained way.
Can you explain that, Laura? Can you explain those contradictory?
Sure. So, I mean, in Arizona and Nevada, they're basically saying the absentee ballots there need to be counted. We need to wait for those votes. They are, in fact, upset with Fox News for having called Arizona in favor of Biden. And yet, then they are turning around in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and saying, we're going to do a recount in Wisconsin. And oh, by the way, what are these extra ballots that are being counted in Pennsylvania? When there is no such thing as sort of extra ballots. These are all valid votes, and we need to just make sure that they get counted so that every voter's vote is not just sort of cast, but also aggregated into their state totals.
Go ahead,
It's worth pointing out that the reason that those votes in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania are still being counted is that the Republican legislatures of those states prevented election officials from being able to count them until election day. In states like Florida and Ohio, where they could vote, where they could count them early, those early votes came in right away. Those mail-in votes were the first ones that were counted, which is why Biden went ahead in those states, and then Trump slowly came back. Here we're seeing the opposite, where Trump's supporters and the election day vote came in first, and now the absentee ballots are being counted, but that's really only an artifact of the fact that they couldn't start counting them until yesterday, and there's a lot of them to do. So this is just normal counting.
Spencer, let me go to you and then to Lena Wen.
Sure, quick note. So Paul mentioned, Republican legislatures prevented the earlier counting of absentees, which is why we're here. But just for context, basically in Pennsylvania, Biden is winning absentees about 4-1 here, 4 or 5 to 1. So maybe 80% of these absentees are breaking toward Biden rather than Trump. And I think that's in part because the president cast a lot of suspicion on vote by mail, and a lot of his supporters avoided vote by mail. So that's kind of the political context. And so if there is a significant gap between Biden and Trump in a place like Pennsylvania, that gap could possibly be closed because Biden has been winning the absentee vote by such a significant margin.
I was going to ask you before going to Lena Wen. I was going to ask you, as you reference those numbers in Pennsylvania, how significant that is. I mean, you got close to this. Let's not make predictions. That's not what we're to do here. But do you see Pennsylvania as highly competitive at this point? It may be several days before we have actual final numbers on them.
Yeah, I think it could. Certainly the fact that many of these absentees are out, many of them are in the Philadelphia area and in the Pittsburgh area, that is a big issue. And I think another issue, and I know we're going to talk about this later, is this curing spoilage issue here. Nationwide, about 1% of ballots are thrown out that are absentees because of these issues. In Pennsylvania in the last 2018, about over 4% of them were. So I suspect some focused challenge on some of those absentee ballots if it comes down to the absentees in Pennsylvania.
Well, you mentioned curing ballots. That's, I think, a good place to bring in Lena Wen, not to cure the ballots, but the rest of us. Lena, you and I had an opportunity to talk in the podcast that we did some time ago. You've been tracking this COVID crisis very, very closely and the political response to it. As you hear people look at exit polls, consider what's going on, how much of a role do you think COVID has played in this election and the results that are still emerging?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I actually would love to hear from the other panelists as to what they think about the contribution of COVID to what voters care about and how we are where we are. I mean, I've been looking at the last several hours and also, frankly, the past few weeks with a lot of horror, frankly, because we are at an unprecedented place in the pandemic. And I don't think that Americans are behaving like it. I mean, we are coming into the worst fall and winter that we'll have seen in our lifetimes. We are seeing the rate of COVID-19 spread just skyrocket with no peak in sight at this moment. I mean, we added 1 million new COVID-19 cases in the last 14 days. We're going to reach the next 1 million much sooner than that. We are seeing hospitals already becoming overwhelmed, especially hospitals in rural areas that have limited capacity at the best of times. And we're not acting like it. I mean, I was looking at all these political rallies that were happening, the Trump rallies with thousands of people crowded together, shoulder to shoulder, not wearing masks, where social distancing and even the idea of protection from the virus was somehow seen as a political symbol, where mask wearing itself has become a cultural touch point rather than a medical and public health imperative. And I am extremely concerned. I'm thinking about this more from the standpoint of, well, whenever it is that we get a winner, what that's going to mean. And I think if there were another Trump 4 years, I think we kind of know what's going to come, which is that we'll see more of the same. But if there is this extended period of not knowing what's going to happen, of counting, recounting, Supreme Court, all these things that my fellow panelists are experts in, but the longer it takes, frankly, the more confused and more divided this country is going to be. And the work that's already a monumental task for trying to control coronavirus is going to be that much harder because we are missing leadership. We're missing clarity. And this mixed messaging is hampering the response at a time when we need it the most.
Laura, I know you've tracked the exit polls to the extent that we know them, and certainly going in, COVID was a defining issue. It wasn't the defining issue because I think you could say that people voted their tribe before they voted their health in a big way. But there were a number of people, I heard from them, and I've seen some of the outputs, people who were in particular cases who did cite the president's response to the COVID pandemic as part of their reason for voting, and in some cases, switching their vote.
Yeah, so it is interesting when you look at the number of people in the exit polls who actually put the economy before COVID, it is substantial. In fact, I think it was about double. And what
they could be related, right?
They could be.
I mean,
but I think there are many people who seem to believe that we can fix the economy somehow before we actually fix the pandemic. And I think anyone who's listening to people like Dr. Wen know that the pandemic first has to be controlled before we can actually create more ways to open the economy and grow businesses. But I will also say there was something fascinating to me in the exits, and this actually speaks more to what both Spencer and Paul were saying about the absentee ballots. And it's that when you look at the validated voter survey of who actually voted in 2016, what you actually saw was that Donald Trump only earned about 39% of the women's vote. In the current exits right now, it says that Donald Trump is winning about 43% of the women's vote. So that would be a change in his direction by 4 points. It's also true that the exits suggest that Donald Trump is earning about 12% of the African-American vote, and that Biden is only earning 89%. That would also be a reduction from 2016 for Biden in terms of the Democratic swing. I don't believe that those current exit numbers are right. And I believe that what we actually know is that the absentee ballots that have yet to be counted and yet to be taken into account in the exits are predominantly both African Americans and women. And we know that partly because we also know that when we surveyed women, many more women said they were going to vote by mail than did.
I think it's such an important point that you make. And, you know, to my friends in television, and especially cable television, any other kind of real time reporting, we need to quit talking about election day and election night and start talking about election week.
Yeah.
Because that's going to give people a much better idea that this kind of information and the exit polls emerge over time. Spencer, you want to comment on that? Because this is your bailiwick as well.
Yeah, well, you know, I want to, there's a discussion about Black men and Black women and kind of the underperformance of Black males with regard to Biden. And I would just say there's a gender gap. Right now, we've got about 12% of the electorate is Black, and about 87% of them total, you know, voted for Biden here. But Black men, about 80% of them were with Biden compared to about 91% of Black women. So you see that performance. Interestingly, that's an 11-point gap. There's also an 11-point gap between Latinx men and women as well here. And with all of this, of course, Black folks outperform with regard to Biden compared to other traditional liberal groups. They're way ahead of Latinos, Asian Americans, LGBT folks, poor folks, labor folks, et cetera. One other quick thing here, just going back to—
Can I just touch back on this? All I'm saying is that the current exits that you're looking at, not final. And
yeah, I got you.
Like the problem is that we've got a lot more votes to count. I think we're actually going to see Joe Biden probably earning 52, maybe even 53% of the total popular vote in the country. And if you look at many of the ballots that are still to be counted, they are in fact the votes that will change those exits to be a little bit different and to be.
I understand your point. There's still going to be a gap between Black men and Black women. There was in the last election. There's still going to be a gap that is there.
Sure.
And I'm just saying that there's a gender gap generally. There's a gender gap in other populations like the Latinx folks and issues like mass incarceration, other issues shape that. I want to get back to Dr. Nguyen's point though. Like Dr. Nguyen was like talking logic here in terms of this pandemic. And I really think what's really tragic about all of this is that the tribes, as you would say, Frank, has like trumped us having a public health discussion and debate about rationally moving forward. We have got one faction that basically says you can campaign, you can go out and go door to door, you can do all of that, that the key is being optimistic and just opening the economy and moving forward. And another group that has a completely different take, and it affects our campaigning, it affects these absentees in terms of when ballot comes in, it affects everything. This divide over some kind of basic science and facts with regard to something that threatens many lives, right? You know, politics, unfortunately, it seems like is more important than that debate here. And I think we're seeing it now in terms of this election.
Our brains are capable of absorbing only so many things at once, and I think they're all oversaturated right now. But Lena, when I want to come back to you, because you said something very alarming a moment ago, that we could be heading into a fall, or we are heading into a fall, that presents a health crisis unlike anything we have seen. Given where we are going, given your concerns, and not the worst case scenario, but the reasonable scenario that you as a health professional are looking at, what exactly are we talking about? Because whatever happens, politics and tribes aside, whoever the next president of the United States is going to have to deal with the reality of this.
Right. And I'm glad that we are talking in these terms, because at this point, it's not a hypothetical. It's not a drill. This is happening right now. So what we're seeing is that we have exceeded our total number, the previous high of the total number of daily new infections. And what's new about this surge, this third surge, if you will, is that back in March, April, the concentration of cases was in New York City and in the Northeast. Then in June, July, it was the Sun Belt. It was California, Florida, Arizona, Texas. Now it is all over the country. So the hotspots are all over the country. And there are some people, including President Trump, who've blamed the number of new infections on testing. But when you actually look at test positivity rates, over the last 7 days, we had test positivity rates in 20 states that were over 10%, which means that the number of detections of new cases that we have, it's not reflecting the actual numbers. The actual numbers of new cases will be much higher, so that every case that we're detecting is actually a canary in a coal mine. There are many other cases where that came from. And so we're already seeing across the Mountain West, across the Midwest, the upper Midwest, some really concerning stories. I mean, in Utah, the University of Utah, starting from a week, 2 weeks ago, canceled their elective surgeries already, so that patients who need hip surgery, heart surgery, cancer surgeries may not be getting them for the immediate near term. We have hospitals in Idaho that are already transferring patients to Seattle, to Portland. Other rural hospitals are finding that they can't transfer their patients anywhere, that patients are now just living basically in their ERs, because these patients that need a higher level of care, now in that region, they have nowhere else to go. So when it comes to things like rationing of healthcare, that's already happening. And this is only the beginning of this most recent surge.
By the time whoever comes out of these next few days puts a hand on the Bible to take the oath of office, we're talking in January,
it's too late.
What are we looking at? What are you talking about? Numbers of death? Where would we be?
So the projections are that by the end of this winter, that we will exceed 500,000 deaths. So by January, maybe that'll be, I don't know, we'll be probably at near double the number of deaths that we have now. We'll be approaching something like 2,000 deaths per day at the trajectory that we're currently going. And so, I mean, I think the hope was, if there is a Trump administration, much the same. If there is a Biden administration, I think many people were hoping that the announcement would have been a lot quicker, that there would be a new president-elect, and that the president-elect would get to work way before January to start, for example, holding daily press briefings, already contacting mayors and governors and health officials, starting to do the work already, because this winter is going to be so deadly. So anything we can do right now is really critical. But the longer the election drags on, the more that looks like that may not be possible for a new administration to come in and start doing that work until.
That's a very interesting real world effect of not having a result for a period of time, and depending on how contested it is. Yeah, Spencer, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if Biden wins, I think he's got to immediately work with Republican leadership to try to take this out of the political piece, right? Like, because
that's going to be really hard to do, and I'm not sure that.
I've got you, but you have to get people to comply, right? Like, you can't just issue an executive order and people are going to follow this. We need people to comply in terms of wearing masks, etc. And so, how do we depoliticize this question now that an election is over? And I understand that you say it'll be difficult. I got you.
Paul, you go ahead, and then I want to come back on the cured ballots, and then we're going to go to questions that we've gotten from the audience because we have a ton of them. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say there are a lot of Republican senators who are wearing masks. It's not sort of monolithic, that this sort of anti-mask crusade. And I think if Trump is a little bit less in the public eye, you might be able to get some at least positive consensus.
Can I just drop in here? I do want to drop in for our wonderful audience that's watching us, and for all of you with a little news update, because it's still in my DNA. That the AP and CNN have called Michigan for Biden.
Yeah, and that's what I was about to say is I think this may not be as contested for as long as Lena is worried about, because I actually think, as these states announce, there are going to be so many states, and Biden doesn't need to win all of them anyway. And so it becomes harder. Are you going to contest all of them? Are you going to send all of them to the Supreme Court? How many votes can you contest to try to reverse this outcome? And I think at a certain point, it becomes inevitable. And hopefully that would be sooner rather than later for all the reasons that Lena was just talking about.
Spencer, if I could very quickly come to you and then to go to questions, because I know we're going to lose Laura a little early here, because I know you have to jump on.
Can I ask Paul a quick question?
Sure.
About what is the kind of time frame where you would see like the Trump campaign contesting or asking for the recount on Wisconsin? Because I know that they're not able to even ask for it until after the canvass, and all of that is like a week away. So does that seem like it would become potentially a moot point?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. So the answer is you have to wait until the canvass, then you ask for the recount, then they do the recount, then they certify the recount. And then if you've got some additional challenges to a court, maybe you would make it at that time. But I think it may be that there's an inevitability by that point, if enough of these states have been called for Biden, that it becomes, as I said, sort of a moot point. That you can't win that many states. You can't sort of use the courts to get back that many votes. How Trump responds to that, I don't know. But it may be that everyone else sees that the writing is on the wall.
Spencer, cured ballots?
Yeah, so cured ballots, basically, these are ballots that are somehow thrown out because, or set aside because they don't have a signature, there's not a signature match, et cetera. Pennsylvania doesn't have great procedures with regard to them. Certainly, maybe in September, the Pennsylvania Secretary of State issued an order and said, okay, you can't just discard an absentee ballot because you think that there's not a signature match. So we won't just discard it. So they provided that directive. But in terms of giving voters an opportunity to come in and correct and cure and those types of things, Pennsylvania is not as clear as other places. One suit that was kind of contested was Montgomery County was actually reaching out to say, hey, there's a problem with your ballot, come on in. And the Trump campaign brought a lawsuit and say, hey, this violates equal protection here. And that's been met with some skepticism. So we'll see there. Getting to Paul's point, though, margin of litigation. And the margin of litigation is really only going to be if there's one state that determines it all, like Florida, and then you have a legal claim that can determine the outcome. If you've got to make that type of claim in 3 or 4 states and go to Wisconsin and ask for a revote and have these challenges all over the place, I just don't think that's within the margin of litigation.
So what would happen? Would the courts then state that this is this is not within the margin of litigation because this is not a determinative case?
Well, I think that some suits would be brought, but they'd be, kind of frowned on. I think even a conservative Supreme Court, I think, this has been framed as Trump setting up a court for himself. But these courts have largely, conservative, philosophy has largely been, let's defer to the states with regard to election procedures, right? That's why some people were so offended by Bush v. Gore, because there were some questions of state law that basically the federal Supreme Court went in and kind of undid after the Florida Supreme Court made some decisions. So I think it's really, there's not a good chance for a Trump campaign
And I certainly
if
don't
they need more than Pennsylvania.
Let me move to some of the questions now that we've got from the audience, because we've got a lot, and I want to throw a couple on the floor here before I know we're going to lose Laura. Several people have asked in one form or another about the Electoral College. I'm going to read just from one of them because it's very specific, but several people are asking, does this show that it doesn't work, or shouldn't we get rid of it, or what would it take? But one person asks, the Electoral College is systematically racist. Wyoming is 92% white, California is 37% white. A Wyoming voter has nearly 4 times more influence than a California voter. What can be done then to abolish the racist Electoral College is the way that question is put. But as I said, several people are asking variations on that. Laura, you want to go first?
Oh, thanks. So the hot button question. Let me just say that I think what we have to understand is that the Electoral College is an artifact of its time, but in some ways it also does what the framers had attempted to do, which was to balance tyrannies of majority with tyrannies of minority. And what really the framers did is they said, look, the House represents the people, the Senate represents the states. If you look at the Electoral College, what it actually does is represent the people through their states. And what that actually means is that for most of our history, most presidents have won both the popular vote, the national popular vote, as well as the majority of their states. Now, I want to just put these statistics out there because I think it's important for people to realize. Since 1860, there have been 26 elections where there has been a popular majority winner. And in those 26 elections, only one of those elections did we have an Electoral College inversion. That was 1876. And if you know anything about that election, it was so fraudulent that quite frankly, we don't really even know the popular vote. The 3 other inversions that we have had since 1860 have happened when the popular vote winner has only earned a plurality of the total popular vote. So in 1888, in 2000, and in 2016. So while we can sit here and say, yes, it's wrong that, say, Hillary Clinton or Al Gore only won the most votes, they also only won 48% of the vote, which meant that 52%, or the majority of the country, in fact, rejected their candidacies. So I think that's important. And then the last thing I'm going to say is the way to think about the Electoral College is that it's like the World Series. When we score the World Series, we do not care how many runs you earned in each game to win it. We only care that you won games. So you had to win 4 games in order to win the World Series. And basically the way the Electoral College works is we have 51 simultaneous games. And for the most part, you got to win the most of them. Now, I will also just end that by saying the problem with the Electoral College is not necessarily the Electoral College. It's the fact that our states passed laws to allocate those electoral votes in a winner-take-all fashion. If we allocated them proportionally, we would actually have a pretty much perfect alignment with the popular vote.
So should that be done? That's what people
I think,
what do we
and
do?
it would also make every single state competitive, because then each party would be trying to essentially run up the score in each state to win a few more ballots. There is a big problem with it, and that is it opens the door to third parties. So then you might need a high bar in order to have electoral votes.
I'm not sure it'd be a bad thing to have a third party. A lot of people would like that. Paul, what's your take on
But
this?
but wait, it's really important. If no one gets a majority in the Electoral College, the House decides. And I think the country would absolutely freak out if the House of Representatives decided a presidential election, even though it's happened in 2 prior elections in our history.
Certainly, much of the country would freak out. Paul?
And particularly because it wouldn't be the House, it would be the House by delegation.
Right.
So again, California gets one vote, Wyoming gets one vote. And so it would simply reinstantiate all the democratic problems that people see in both the Senate and in the Electoral College. I have a very different view of the Electoral College from Laura. I think it's a problem that we now have a system where 7 out of the last 8 elections, for the first time in history, one party has won the popular vote in 7 out of 8. And yet it's extremely hard for that party to ever govern. I think it's a problem that we now have a Supreme Court where a majority of the justices were appointed by presidents who didn't win the popular vote and confirmed by senators who collectively didn't win the popular vote. And because of our extreme residential sorting, which did not exist at the time of the framing and the time of the Electoral College being created, we now have a situation where it is very possible that a permanent rural minority will wield disproportionate power over a permanent urban majority. And I don't think a democracy can work for long under those circumstances. The demographics suggest that 85% of the American people will live in only 15 states. Well, that means that 15% of the population will live in 35 states that will collectively create 70 senators. And that's a recipe for—
You're going beyond where the Electoral College is here, though. You're going to the composition of the United States.
But it's both, right? So everything that you see with senators is also
Spencer,
part of the Electoral College.
Spencer, what's your position on that, particularly the racial people in that question?
Sure. So part of the reason, like you all said, that the Electoral College is problematic is because of the Senate. You'll remember the Electoral College is based on 2 votes for each senator, right? And then 1 more additional vote for each House member. So small states are overrepresented here because of that. And just as they are overrepresented in terms of the Senate, there are about 2.7 million people in Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, and Dakota. And they get the same representation as 110 million diverse folks who live in places like California, Texas, Florida, New York, right? White folks have on average, white folks have 0.35 senators per million people. Black folks have 0.26 senators per million. Asian Americans 0.25 and Latinos 0.19. So that's the Senate, and that is basically translated into the Electoral College here. One way to my concern that problem isn't dealt with the proportional representation solution that Laura mentioned here in terms of the votes, Electoral College votes. And I think one suggestion has been this kind of popular vote compact. I think it's difficult because you need a constitutional amendment to revise it. There is a compact where if enough states opt into the compact through their state legislatures, then they agree that their electoral votes will go to whoever is the popular vote winner. And that's probably the most pragmatic way to make it happen, because North Dakota is never going to go along with changing the Constitution.
And that's a point I'd like to make. I mean, Spencer, for the record,
right.
What would it take to change the Electoral College?
It would either be a constitutional amendment,
which requires how many states?
Yeah, which is a supermajority, right? Or what you could do is you could get those states that equal over 270 votes, those states, and you get them to enter into a compact and an agreement and say, whoever gets the most votes, that's where our electoral votes will go. So if you got Texas and California and New York and enough to get your 270, and you get them to agree to go with whoever is the popular vote winner nationally, you could do that, and that you could bypass North Dakota and Nebraska, and Wyoming, and those places.
It's another scenario. We wouldn't hold our breath.
Can I throw one more thing out there?
Quickly.
So the exit polls, I just want to say this right before I take off. The exit polls basically show that Trump won the vote in the Midwest and in the South, and that Biden won the vote in a very large way in the East and the West. So while I know the Electoral College, I'm sort of like in the world of Alexander Hamilton on this. I don't think it is perfect, but I do believe that the problem is not essentially the structure itself, it's close elections, and it's the fact that we have a very regionally divided country. And I don't know that just, making the East and the West the predominant majority is going to reduce angst or acrimony in this country. So I think it's important to realize there is a way that the Electoral College forces the presidential candidates to win more states by narrow amounts than it does ask them to run up certain states' votes. And I just think that's
Spencer, you wanted to respond to that?
No, I'm
No?
good.
Okay.
Go
Lena,
ahead.
this is a fascinating subject, and it is filled with both our history and our culture and all the realities that you all have just mentioned, and subject for maybe a class or something else that we can do another time in more detail. But it comes to the fore, and I think, Paul, the observation you made about the disconnect between parties getting the popular vote and parties winning is something that's very much on people's minds. Lena, this question is for you, or some variation of it. Obviously, this is from the audience as well. Obviously, the Democrats did not anticipate the race being this close. So do you think that COVID was not as much an issue as having a thriving economy under Trump, even though this person says that he or she believes that if you fix the virus, the economy will be better for us all? I mean, you touched on this a little bit, Lena, this relationship between COVID and economy and how it plays, in your view, from a public health perspective, maybe very different than how it plays from a political perspective.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I was watching the exit polls yesterday, and the way that people ranked the various issues. I don't know that it's so much the ranking and the prioritization that surprised me. It was the fact that people don't see, as I think so many of us in public health do, how interrelated COVID is to the economy, and not in this antagonistic way. I think actually that President Trump has been very effective at somehow branding public health as being the enemy of the economy, and also as the enemy of things like schools and having fun and whatever it is that people would want in their lives, when actually we know that having the virus under control is what will allow us to regain all these things that we enjoyed as part of our pre-pandemic life. I mean, we look at Asian countries that haven't had a case of COVID-19 in hundreds of days and months, and how they're able to regain their economy. But I think there is this broader point too that I also am very worried about, that has come through so strongly in President Trump's messaging, in the sense that it's hard. And this is not about politics here, but rather about the effect on COVID-19, and that is this all or nothing approach. This idea that either you shut down everything,
Right.
or else you do nothing and just ignore the virus and let it run rampant, and who cares if people die? I mean, I'm framing it simplistically because that is how President Trump has essentially framed it. And actually, we know that that's not it at all. That actually there are many things that we can do that are simple steps, like mask wearing, and these projections will save over 100,000 lives if Americans just adopted universal mask wearing between now and the end of this winter. I mean, that's remarkable. That's not shutting anything down. But I think it is this framing that I think somehow Democrats, but also the public health community at large, just has not gotten quite right, where mask wearing has been seen as a political symbol rather than as the way for us to actually get back to
You know what I
our
wonder, and
pre-pandemic
this is total, a thought bubble here, and I'd be interested in anybody's thoughts on it. If Donald Trump wins, he doesn't have the politics of COVID anymore, presumably. Does he take a different approach to it? If Donald Trump loses, does he adopt another posture on this as the disease gets worse, or do you think it stays as it is, and this is where he is and where he stays?
I honestly cannot imagine, and I would love to hear what Spencer and Paul have to say, but I just cannot imagine, if Trump were to win, that he would somehow take a different approach. He's had so many opportunities to take a different approach, right? Even from the Bob Woodward book and the revelations there, from the time that he got sick himself from COVID. I mean, that wasn't that long ago. He had an opportunity to take a very different approach that other leaders have. We'll look at Boris Johnson and what he did after his COVID diagnosis. We haven't seen Trump change his tune, and I don't know why we would think that he would change his. In fact, if anything, he would double down on this. COVID isn't real. We've rounded the corner. Let people die.
Spencer, you were inside an
Yeah.
administration, I mean, things change.
Yeah. I think that things change. I don't know that he's going to change. I think what's going to happen is that it will be the beginning of 2024 primary season in the Republican Party if he loses. There will be one camp that says, see how we messed up. I'm the anti-Trump. There'll be another camp that is like trying to get his voters and get those folks for Iowa and kind of the early caucuses and primaries. And I think that will be the debate within the party. And the question is more largely, can we, get a cultural, people wearing a mask being tied up to somebody's identity, right? That's where we are right now, where people feel like their liberties are infringed upon because of this mask, and their identity is tied into not wearing a mask. And the question is, can we get enough folks to kind of depoliticize that and focus on the public health issues?
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other faction in the Republican Party is going to be Trump himself. If he loses, he's already a candidate for 2024 potentially.
Yes.
So I think don't discount that. And I totally agree. This economy versus public health thing is such a crazy dichotomy. If you want the economy to work, if you want to go out to restaurants, if you want to do things, wear a mask, and it's much easier to actually get those
And
done.
wear a mask and understand that when you're wearing a mask, you are doing that to protect everybody around you.
Right,
There
but
is no
you
conception of freedom
Right.
that requires that we harm other
Right.
people, right?
But-
Your freedom only extends to the extent that you are not harming somebody else.
But you all are talking facts. You're talking about where we want the country to be as a normative matter, as opposed to this descriptive reality, which is where we are as a country in terms of how people are divided over this. And so I agree with you in terms of where we want to go. I just think we have to take into account the political reality of the division over this to figure out how we get to where you say we need to be, where I agree we need to be.
Right. Whoever the next president is, whether Trump or Biden, as I say, is going to have to deal with the harsh realities of what Lena Lim has laid out for us here, because that is not politics. That's real.
Mhm.
I want to end with two questions actually from the audience they're sort of related, which is how do we talk to one another and across these lines, and how do we deal with this time? So here's one. How can we hear the other side and have productive debate? The media often makes every issue seem black and white, as though anyone who disagrees with the Democratic platform should be demonized. Clearly, about half the nation disagrees, especially those in rural areas. How can urban and rural citizens have honest, productive dialogue? While you're thinking about that, and you'll give us the definitive answer here, I am sure, a modestly related question is sort of interesting and cuts a little closer to home, but it's related. Can you suggest, someone writes here, can you suggest productive ways to talk about this in a class that is not otherwise focused on contemporary American politics, divided? Should we, and how do we, discuss the election with students? Lena, you're the doctor here. I think we should take your advice. So why don't you go first? Prescribe a way for us to talk across our differences.
I wish I knew the answer here. What comes to mind initially is one word, which is empathy. And I think that empathy, kindness, if you will, another word that I think has been missing in our dialogue, in our political discourse. I think these will be really critical. I know there was a conversation about third parties earlier, and I don't, appreciate the comments about why this is not a feasible thing in America, perhaps right now. I do think that there are increasing numbers of people who just don't feel like the parties and whatever platforms of the parties or the leaders of those parties speak for them. That as maybe as a result of social media and our times, that there are just loud voices on both sides that are not speaking for the majority of America. And I actually think that most Americans, including our students, want to have those dialogues without being labeled and stigmatized and shamed and called names for their views, which may be open to change. But we have to start with empathy, start with kindness, and also have the space to be able to have these conversations where people aren't labeled and shamed for views that they might have. And I would include, incidentally, thoughts, things that I may feel very strongly about, including the idea of mask wearing being a political issue. I mean, things like that, or vaccines, people being anti-vaccine or not trusting science and having conspiracy theories. I want all that to be on the table for people to feel that they have a space and an openness to listen and learn.
Thank you, Doctor.
So
Paul?
one thing that would support what Lena just said is that there have been experiments in kind of citizen panels where they get together 100 people from a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds, and over the course of a day or 2 days they provide a lot of data and factual information about a topic. There's a lot of discussion back and forth, and a decent effort to come to consensuses, and it is relatively successful. Now, I'm not saying that's how we should make our decisions as a society. It's unwieldy and unrealistic, but it does suggest that if we actually had at least some forum where we can talk with an agreed set of facts, then we actually could reach consensuses more often. Part of the problem right now is that we don't even have an agreed set of facts as to what we're debating. Like, you can't have a debate about what to do about the coronavirus if the person you're talking to doesn't think it exists. Then it's very hard to have that discussion. So I think there has to be more work made to create or to try to stimulate a consensus group of facts. And that goes to, things like social media and responsibility of social media companies. We don't have a Walter Cronkite. We don't have a Frank Sesno at CNN telling us information that then most of America believes is true. Right now, we have a situation where there isn't any set of facts that most of America thinks is true, it seems. And it's hard to see how a democracy functions that way.
On the long haul, exactly. Spencer?
I agree with Lena and Paul, but I'd also add one other thing, that private sector and political leaders, I think, have to be much more sophisticated about talking about the future of work. Too often we've left folks behind, whether it's kind of the rural South, Black folks and white folks, whether it's the so-called Rust Belt, whether it is coal country. And, people need to see themselves in our future. There are other places in the world that have really moved forward quickly in terms of leapfrogging, when we talk about Singapore or even Rwanda after their tragedy, or South Korea, that really focused on what is the world going to be like and how do we ensure that we have a workforce that's skilled. Right now, I think folks feel like, the coast, that there are some jobs and people have prosperity. And I think there's massive inequality and lack of opportunity and hope and excitement about the future. And so this concept of really talking about the future of work in a more sophisticated way, that's not a left-right way, but one that makes sure that American workers are ready for the future economy to compete and ensure we're strong, I think is critical.
Spencer, I'm going to give you the last word in this conversation. Last question, last word to you, because the work you've done in voting and ballots and transitions and all the rest. Okay, you've seen what's happened since we've been discussing this today with the state of Michigan. We've talked about that in Wisconsin. Where are you now seeing this going? How do you handicap this situation? Leave us with your assessment of exactly where we are right now, today, on the question at hand, which is, who will be the next president of the United States?
We're going to have a battle if it comes down to one state. If it comes down to just to Pennsylvania and that determines an outcome, we're going to have a battle and it's going to be drawn out. If not, and if, it's not just one state, if Biden can win without Pennsylvania, I think that Biden ends up winning, and he's got a very fractured country with a Senate that possibly is run by Republicans, and he's got to figure out how to move us forward together.
All right. Well, on those words, we shall see, as they say, and we shall see in the next several days, because we're going to be getting more of these states unfolding. We may get Georgia tonight. We may get Pennsylvania by the end of the week. So we'll start to see a number of these states spool out. Spencer Overton and Paul Berman and Lena Wen, and on behalf of Laura Brown, who had to leave earlier to go do another interview, thanks to everybody for joining us. This is some of what the George Washington University does and stand for, which is really thoughtful conversation with people who have studied and lived and practiced it. And we're delighted to be part of this larger community and to have had you join us. So stay engaged, stay tuned, and good luck to everybody as we go forward. Thanks and good night.
Thanks.